Um, we are we are on page 41b, and we're actually starting. We started this already. I feel bad because it's a little choppy because we started it right before I left, and now again we have a break of Purim tomorrow. So what I'd like to do is simply go over what we did right before I left, and we'll at least we'll remember it hopefully for Friday, so that Friday we'll have it clear. Friday we'll be able to go deeper into it. So we're on 41b. We're about 10 lines from the top of the page, and the Gemara starts off with Itmar. Itmar, it was said in the Beis Medrash. So it was said amongst the rabbis, the rabbinic students in the Beis Medrash, the following statement, and they brought different opinions of the rabbis. There were people that were eating a meal, and they brought before them te'enim, which means figs, va'anovim, and date and grapes. So they brought before someone who's eating a meal, they brought figs and grapes. B'soy chasuda. It's in the midst of a meal. So the question is, do you recite a bracha? Not only is the question, do you recite a bracha? The question is, do you recite a bracha before? Do you recite a bracha after? Do you recite a bracha on both, before and after? So again, certain things are obvious to us. For example, on bread, you recited the bracha hamoitzi on the bread. The birchas hamazon, the grace after meal, is going to cover the bread. What about other foods? If you have bread with peanut butter and jelly sandwich, so is the peanut butter and jelly covered? So these are the questions. What about if you have a side dish? Is that going to be covered when you wash? What about melon? Is that going to be covered? Dessert, drinks. So these are the issues that we are dealing with. And of course, we generally assume that everything is covered when we wash, but it's not as simple as it sounds. There is a lot of discussion about dessert. Is dessert covered? There are a lot of people that would tell you, there are a lot of rabbis that would question if you should be reciting a bracha on dessert. Generally, the understanding is yes. There's a discussion about ice cream. Is ice cream considered a drink, or is it considered a food? And
you're not sure, leave it on the table and stare at it, and you'll get more confused.
You'll be healthier, but if you do that, but
and then you have more of a question.
But there is a thought that maybe ice cream is really a liquid. Just happens to be because if you leave it for a little while, it become a liquid. So maybe it should be considered a drink. On the other hand, in the form that it's at this point, it's a solid. So it should be like a food, and it's like a dessert food. And so there's reason to say a bracha on the even during a meal on the ice cream. So it's a argument between the rabbis about ice cream. Cake is another issue, because the problem is the cake that we have often is not 100% mezainos. It's called bread. The cake that we have in the Talmudic language is called pas haba b'kisnin. It's a type of bread. It's a semi bread. That's the term the Gemara uses for cake. Pas haba b'kisnin, because there's different opinions of what exactly that is. So there also is going to be an issue, should you recite a bracha on it, because maybe it's just like a different type of bread. And if you have a different type of bread during your meal, you would not be reciting a bracha. So do we consider cake bread? It's just a different type of bread. So you had white bread in the beginning of the meal. Now you have chocolate bread in the end of the meal. So it's still bread. Or do we consider it? No, this is mezainis. This is pasa babakisnin, which would be or is it really considered bread? So however you whatever you're eating, there are a lot of challenging questions even during a meal. Even during a meal, there are scenarios where it's a little unclear, and there are questions as to the bracha. And so don't assume just because you're in the middle of a meal that everything is as simple as it sounds. I've been at people's tables where they put bread on their ice cream to eat it together with the bread so that they don't have a shiloh. So it's like it's being eaten with the bread, and therefore they don't recite a shahakal on the ice cream because they're eating it together with their bread. And it exempts them from reciting, being in a state of questions. I'm just sharing with you the extent people go to cover themselves from these type of questions. But there are different opinions as to some of these matters. So now we're going to see from the Gemara, from the Talmudic perspective, even before it develops into a halacha to Shulchan Aruch, even before it develops into the code of law, where does this come from? So we're starting here at the two dots. Itmar, they said in the Beis Medrash, they brought before them these figs and grapes, the seichasud that's in the midst of a meal. And Rashi tells us that you're not going to be eating bread with it. You're not smearing. This is not jam. They brought you figs and grapes, but you're not smearing it on top of your bread, because if that was so, if this is jam, then you would end up not needing a bracha. So peanut butter and jelly sandwich, no question, you do not need a bracha on the peanut butter and jelly, because that would be tafel. It would be considered secondary to the bread. So that is not. So here we're talking about they brought it during the meal, but not to eat with bread. And Rashi uses the term, it's coming to sweeten one's mouth, lamatek espiv, with fruits. So Amar Rav Huna, so Rav Huna's opinion, Tu'unim bracha, Rav Huna says, Tu'unim bracha lefneim, you need to recite a bracha before, ve'ein tu'unim bracha lachreim, you do not need a bracha afterwards, which tells us that there's a difference between the hamoitzi blessing that you recite on the bread and the berachas hamazon that you recite after the end of the meal. That the bracha on bread does not necessarily cover everything, but the berachas hamazon seems to be much more inclusive. And the berachas hamazon, the grace after meal, will cover these fruits, but you do need to recite a bracha before you eat the fruits, because these fruits are not included in the bracha you said on the bread, and they're not secondary to bread, and therefore you would need to recite a bracha beirei pri ha'etz. You would need to recite a bracha before them, according to Rav Huna. V'chein amar Rav Nachman. So we have two opinions, Rav Nachman and Rav Huna. Rav Nachman says the same thing. Tu'unim bracha lefneihem. You need to recite a bracha before them. V'yein tu'unim bracha le'achreihem. You do not need a bracha after them. And the reason is because after them, the bracha of grace after meal covers those fruits as well. But you would need a bracha before them. Again, this is the opinion of Rav Huna and Rav Nachman. Now, Rav Sheshas argues. Rav Sheshas says, you need to recite a bracha, whether before or after. And these items are not included in the berachas hamazon. They're not included in the hamoitzi. You need two brachas. You need a bracha before and the bracha afterwards. And these actually are from the 7 species. So the bracha afterwards would be al ha'etz v'al pri ha'etz. You would need to recite that bracha afterwards, because the berachas hamazon, the grace after meal, does not cover it. And Rashi emphasizes here, he says that these foods are not satisfying foods. They're not there to satiate you. They're not midi design. They're not foods that satiate a person. And you would need to recite a bracha before it and after it. And Rashi is implying that if it would satiate you, then you would not need a bracha, at least at the end, because the Berachas Hamazon should cover that. But these foods do not satiate, therefore you would need a bracha. You would need a bracha both before and after. Now, Rav Sheshes continues his statement, and he adds an interesting point. She'ein lecha davar, because there is nothing Shato bracha lefanav that does require a bracha before, ve'ein tu'in bracha liachrav, and does not need a bracha afterwards. There's nothing in that category. Where do you ever have such a thing that you need a bracha before and you don't need a bracha after it? Very rare. Only ela pas haba b'kisnin bavad. Only in one case. Only in a case of pas haba b'kisnin, in a case where bread is eaten. Rashi translates this: bread is eaten with kernels. That after a meal, after a person benched, after a person says the grace after meal, and he eats, there was customary to have these certain kernels of grain, and they would eat bread with it. And the kernels were considered very healthy. And the bread that they would eat with it had a lot of spices in it. And they had different pictures on it. Rashi tells us the bread was formed in different forms, either like birds or trees. And person would eat a small amount of it, and they would put a lot of different spices in it, and they would put nuts in it, walnuts and almonds, and the person ate a little of it. There you do not recite a bracha afterwards, similar to the bread made from rice and millet. Bread made from rice and millet, you do not recite an al hamichya afterwards, even though you might recite a mezainos beforehand, but you would not recite an al hamichya afterwards. So the same thing is there. That would be a similar case to this case where you recite a bracha before and you don't recite a bracha afterwards. And when Rashi says you don't recite a bracha afterwards, it doesn't always mean you don't recite any bracha afterwards. It means you don't recite one of the main brachas afterwards, which is like either al hamichya or Berachas Hamazon, grace after meal, but you would recite a Barei Nefashos. It's a little unclear. Rashi doesn't tell us clearly. In this case, you would have to recite a Barei Nefashos. We know from the other case of rice, if a person had rice bread, you do recite a Barei Nefashos, even though the Gemara says you don't recite a bracha afterwards. And Rashi explains that means you don't recite one of the major brachas afterwards, but you do recite the generic Barei Nefashos bracha afterwards. And so here, Rashi doesn't tell us with pas haba b'kisnin, if you're eating this bread with this, the bread together with these kernels, which Rashi says you're only eating a little, and for some reason, you do not need a bracha afterwards, you recite a bracha before it. Rashi's, and what the Gemara is saying, according to this, is that where do you have a case that you say a bracha before and not after? You don't. This is very rare. And Rav Sheshes therefore says that when you eat these figs or grapes within a meal, you would need a bracha afterwards as well. You need a bracha before and after, because it's very rare to have a case where you don't recite a bracha afterwards. And the Gemara gave one example of pas haba b'kisnin. Now, Taisus, of course, asks a very strong question. He says, Rashi himself tells us that it's similar to rice and millet bread. So why did the Gemara say then that the only case is this pas haba, this bread that's eaten with kernels? Why is that? The Gemara says that's the only case. Rashi goes and jumps and says, oh, it's similar to rice bread and millet bread. Oh, so it's not the only case then. That means there's other cases as well. So Tais says, so then why did the Gemara say that as well? That is that the only cases where you have a bracha before and not after is rice and millet bread and pas haba b'kisnin. So the commentaries, including Taisus, don't like Rashi's explanation here, and therefore they have another interpretation, and that's what the halacha follows. And we spoke about a little more at length. We did speak about what's possible bekisnin. I just mentioned it a little earlier also, that our cake is really called possible bekisnin. The only question is, depends on which cake, it depends on which opinion. Some cakes, according to some opinions, would be possible bekisnin. I'll give you an example. There are cakes that the dough is just a bread dough, and the cake turns into cake because they add filling to it. In fact, we had a bakery in Rhode Island, where I come from, that went out of business. And it could be the reason they went out of business was because they made one dough in the morning, and everything that they baked was all from that same dough. So they used the same dough for the bread, they used the same dough for their cakes, for this and that, at least a lot of things they made with the same dough. And they figured this is easier, right? So they how did they make their cakes, their danishes? They used this bread dough, and they put their chocolate inside the danish, or their strawberry filling inside the danish, and that's how they. Now, according to one opinion, that is called pas haba bekisnin. It's a bread dough, but it has a filling of strawberry inside, and therefore that would be considered a mezainis, that you would recite a bracha mezainis of pas haba bekisnin, and it would be considered a cake. It would be considered, it's a type of bread that would require a bracha mezainis. Now that's one opinion. So it's a bread dough, but it has filling. In fact, that fits very well with the wording. Pas haba bekisnin, bread that comes with a pocket. Kisnin would be like a pocket. So it's a pocket of fruit or chocolate or cinnamon or some other delicious inside filling, cherry filling, whatever. And that would be considered a mezainis. Now, the way those opinions learn this Gemara, again, the way the common view is, besides for Rashi, the other opinions is that we're dealing with it's not telling us what the law would be if you eat this outside of a meal. It's really talking about inside a meal. The way Rashi learned, we're talking about after a meal, after you benched, and you don't have to recite an after blessing. The way the other commentaries learn this, we're dealing with the inside a meal. You wouldn't have to recite an after blessing, because the after blessing of the Berachas Hamazon, the grace after meal, covers the cake. So I just mentioned to you one opinion again. So according to this opinion, that you eating this cake, this Danish that has a filling of strawberry or chocolate with a bread dough, and you ate it during a meal, you would recite a mezainis, but you would not recite the al hamichya afterwards, because the grace after meal will cover it. Now, there is a different opinion, the Rambam, who says that the pas haba bekisnin does not mean a pocket. It really means that the dough is not a bread dough. It's a dough that has spices in the dough, and it has there are different liquids, not water. It's made with apple juice or some other, or milk or other liquids besides for water. And because of that, that is what pas haba bekisnin is. It's not a regular bread with flour and water. It's flour and oil, flour and apple juice, flour and corn syrup, and flour, all different liquids, and eggs, flour and eggs. So all of these things would, according to the Rambam, that would be what's pas haba bekisnin. Again, that would be the case here, that if you eat that during a meal, you would not need to recite a after blessing, because it's included in the meal, but you would need to recite a bracha beforehand, and that's what pas haba bekisnin is. So the question is, what happens if you have cake during a meal? What do you do? So if you have the Danish cake where it's made from a bread dough, if it's a bread dough and there's just a filling, and you're eating this as dessert, would you need to recite a bracha? Well, it would depend. According to the first opinion that I mentioned, that's pas haba bekisnin. You need to recite a bracha. According to the Rambam, you would say, no, this is bread. You have your filling in it. Okay, you're filling, but the bread is bread, and the bread is hamaitzi. It's included in the bracha that you recite in the beginning of the meal. So because of this problem, most people do not recite a bracha on cake which is a dessert, because we don't know who the opinion follows. And according to, so for example, let's say you're having a different cake for dessert. Let's pick a cake that you're having chocolate cake. So you have chocolate cake without frosting, and you're having this chocolate cake without frosting at the end of a meal, and you want to know, should you recite a bracha? So according to the Rambam, this chocolate cake is generally made from a dough that might have zero water or have very little water, at least less than half of the liquid in it is water, more oil and other liquids and eggs. So according to this, the Rambam would say you would need to recite a bracha mezainos on this chocolate cake. However, according to the other opinion, it needs to have a pocket filled with something, either chocolate frosting or other types of fillings, cherry filling. So only in that case would you recite a mezainos. In this case, the fact is it doesn't have that filling. So according to that opinion, you would not recite a bracha on it, because this is no different than regular bread, because it doesn't have the filling in it. So according to that opinion, you would not recite a bracha on this chocolate cake for dessert. Now, what happens if it's chocolate cake with frosting? So if it has frosting, you may say that this fits both views, because chocolate cake with frosting, the frosting could be considered like a pocket with a lot of liquid, some type of a filling. You could say maybe the frosting is the filling, and the dough is made with a minority of water. Therefore, it would seem that you could recite a mezainos on the chocolate cake with frosting. But there is a third view, and that's what creates some problems. The Alter Rebbe does not bring the third view in his Seder Berachos Hanenin. So for Lubavitcher, I think you probably recite a mezainos on cake for dessert if it has frosting, or a Danish nowadays, because the Danishes generally that you buy is probably not a bread dough. I gave an example of a bread dough Danish, but that's not the common Danishes that they make today. The Danishes that they make today are way too soft. I'm pretty sure it's full of oil and maybe some apple juice. So it would seem to me that it's not a bread dough. So the Danishes of today, if you had a Danish for dessert, that's a filled Danish, has a filling in it, or it would seem to me that the bracha would be mezainos for dessert if you're eating it as dessert, because according to all opinions, according to the Alter Rebbe, all the opinions that he quotes, that seems to fit both views. But there is a third view, and that's quoted in the Shulchan Aruch, and that has to do with something more crunchy and or flaky. And then you might, according to that view, these might not be mezainos. And therefore, according to that view, maybe you would have to recite a hamaitzi on this, and the only time you would recite a mezainos during the meal would be something that's more flaky or crunchy. And so if you want to follow that view as well, then you're going to have a hard time reciting a mezainos for dessert. You'd probably not recite a mezainos for dessert. Someone told me maybe an apple strudel, which is more flaky, maybe that would be an example, according to all opinions, that would be a mezainos. But in any event, this is the sword. This is where we have this pas haba b'kisnin. It's our Gemara here, and it mentions, Rav Sheshes mentions that the only time, even though Rav Sheshes says normally you have to recite both brachas before and after, but there is an example of pas haba b'kisnin where you would recite a bracha before and not a bracha afterwards. And this is, as long as you're not learning like Rashi, you have the example of cakes and danishes and things during a meal, which would be the deciding factor as to reciting a bracha for dessert. Okay, we had a few questions. I see Simone. Simone, do you want to ask something?
Yeah, so it seems this is relevant to Hamantashen, which
actually, yeah, I was thinking about hamantaschen. Right, I forgot to mention it. That's right. Because hamantaschen, if they cook it a lot, it would be crunchy. And the dough is that's a good point. The dough is I think it's not a bread dough. I think it's more of a cake dough with oil and very little water, if any. So yeah, I would think that hamantaschen during a meal would be a mezainis, according to maybe it. Well, it depends also how if it's crunchy, then you could have all three views probably. But for Lubavitchers, even if it's not crunchy, you have the other two views because it's filled and the dough is a mezainis dough. I would think for dessert you would need to recite a bracha on hamantaschen. You can ask your local rabbi if they agree with me, but that's my thought. Yes. Simone, do you have another question or is your hand still up? Okay. Ben.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, is it always mezonos then before and borei nefashot after, or is there different blessings? Like
No. If you're eating during a meal, so this was the example where you have a bracha before, the one case that you have a bracha before, when you're eating during a meal, you have a bracha before and you don't have a bracha afterwards. This is the one scenario. So there's no bracha after because the grace after meal is going to cover it.
But Rabbi Papa says that if it's after the meal that you're eating something.
Okay, 1 second. You're jumping ahead.
Oh, right. Okay.
I stopped here, Rav Sheshes. I
Okay,
wanted
so
to like bring up.
Up to then, if it's in the meal, you still say mezonos.
Right. So that's what I was mentioning, that this would be a case where you have dessert and you could find cases where it would be mezainis, or according to some opinions, it would be mezainis. And then it would be a question for us because we don't know, because one opinion would say mezainis, other opinions say don't recite a mezainis. It could be considered bread.
Yeah.
Therefore, we would want to be strict and not say a bracha.
But if you need to say, you say mezonos.
If everyone agrees that there's a mezainis, then you could recite the mezainis. But yeah. Okay. I think there was someone else who had a question. I don't see now. Yeah. Oh, Reuven. Yeah, that was you.
I've seen some people try to solve the problem by benching before dessert, saying birka, and then saying a mezainis on the dessert afterward.
Right. That is correct. That's a good point. I should have mentioned that. Correct. Yeah, there are a lot of people, very careful people, to that want to make sure they're not eating something without a bracha. If it's possibly an obligation to recite a bracha or a questionable obligation, and so if you eat it afterwards, then you have no problem. But it would seem to me like there might be certain foods that that don't fall into this category. Like for example, this hamantaschen or a Danish or chocolate frosting, cake with chocolate frosting maybe. Now, there is we also mentioned about pizza on before I left on Monday a week ago. We mentioned about pizza, and we mentioned that there is a concept that called mezainis bread and mezainis bagels and mezainis pizza, and it's based on this discussion here of the fact that if you use apple juice instead of water, would that cause your sandwich to be a mezainis? And you wouldn't need to wash for bread. You wouldn't need to say the whole grace after meal. Is there a way to get around the hamaitzi time, the amount of time that it takes to wash and to bench? Is there a way around it? Is there some loophole? And in fact, we once had a comedian come for him to an event I organized, and he said, I figured out a whole answer to this whole problem of washing. I wash once, and every 72 minutes, I make sure to take a bite. I still haven't benched yet. So just a little joke that he made during his gig. But the point is, some people they find it too hard to bench, and they're looking for some way around benching and washing, and so they think that there's a way to do it while eating a mazinus roll. Problem is, if you eat a mazinus roll with in a form of a meal, it no longer really has its mazinus category. Depends on how much, of course, but there is an issue there with eating too much of a mazinus roll. Does turn into a hamut. And the other problem is when it comes to pizza, for example, would pizza be considered a mazinus? Let's say the dough was made with water, but you have cheese and sauce on it. So would you consider that similar to a Danish, like it has a pocket of other foods? Would that cause it to be a mazinus because it has those other delicate, delicious foods, the sauce and the cheese, added to it? So would that be like a pocket of cheese and sauce in a bread dough? Would pizza, even if the dough was made like a bread, would you be able to say, well, according to one opinion, it's really mazinus because it has a pocket of cheese and sauce? So some want to say that. There are those opinions that want to say, well, it's considered, regular pizza could be considered a mazinus. The Alter Rebbe in his Seder Berch Sanen does not go for that. He says the only pocket that's mazinus is something filled with something that's meant not for filling, but for enjoyment, like sugary cherry filling or strawberry filling or chocolate filling or cinnamon and sugar filling and other types of delicious something meant for pleasure, not for filling. So pizza, according to the Alter Rebbe, if it's made with water, that is bread, and it wouldn't matter how much you eat of it, that would be considered bread, and you would need to recite a hamotzi on pizza, according to the Alter Rebbe, if it's made with water. Now, if it's made with apple juice, which is this is the loophole that they want to take, and they make pizza with apple juice, that would be room to say it's mazinus, because according to the Rambam, that would be considered pasa b'kisnin. It would be mazinus, and being that it would be mazinus, at least according to one opinion, there would be room to recite a mazinus on it. You would have the problem of the other opinion that says, well, it's not really, you don't really have a pocket full, you don't have a pocket full of anything sugary or very tasty for pleasure. So according to that opinion, it would not be mazinus. And then the other issue would be, how much are you eating? How much pizza are you eating? According to that book that I showed you on Monday, a week ago, according to that book, one piece of pizza is quite a large amount of kezesim, of olives. And we think that it's, it's just an olive. No, it's about 9. I think it said it's like 9 olives or something. And depending on how much you eat, you would need to recite a hamotzi, even though it's made with apple juice. Now, that book that I brought from, it seemed that they might follow the other view, different than the Alter Rebbe, and therefore, even if it's made with water, they do have a leniency there that you might be able to recite a mazinus on pizza made with water, because of the fact that there's cheese, and that could be room for leniency. Again, for Lubavitchers, that wouldn't work, but for non-Lubavitchers, there might be room for some leniency if you want to find the loophole, and you're eating a very little amount, to recite a mazinus on it. Maybe there's some room for leniency. Ezra, you had a question, Ezra?
Yeah. So how do you consider pizza to be to have a pocket, because
Well, it's the point
definition
is
of-
not, yeah, the point is not to have a pocket. It's to have a large amount of filling. It means to have a filling. And so it doesn't have to necessarily be in it, on it, in it, with it, with it is basically, it's a filling with it. It's eaten with this filling. That's how, but it's a good question. Ben, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to say some pizzas can have on top more than you can put in a pocket.
That's it. Then there's more room for leniency. But the problem is are you eating it to fill yourself, or is it more for pleasure? And generally, cheese and the sauce is all part of the meal that you're eating. And then afterwards, you have your dessert for pleasure, but not the cheese. So, Moshe, you had a question.
Yeah, calzone is probably meant for that purpose, to say mazanot, because if you notice that you go into a kosher kingdom or someplace like that, they have the pizza and then the calzones, which is underneath. So for those people who want to say mazanot,
So Moshe is saying that the people who are nervous that it's not called a pocket, pizza is not really a filling. The cheese is not in a filling, so they make the calzone in order to cover that. I just thought it was a way of charging an extra $3 or $5 and making something a little different. But maybe that's an interesting thought. I didn't think of that. So thank you, Moshe. Okay, well, my time is up. And
Rabbi
on Friday, Mitzvah Shem, we will continue.
Rabbi Smith?
Yeah.
I'd like to ask a question about it. I've always heard, and I don't know, I just accepted this as a rule, that if we had 2 pieces of pizza, we had to make hamotzi, and if we only ate one, even with the cheese and even with olives or whatever it had on it, it was mazonot.
Right. So that's based on the fact that's based on that leniency that I mentioned that is not acceptable for a Lubavitcher. But for others, you might be able to say that it's considered like a filling. Cheese is a filling, and you're eating it not as a meal if you're eating one slice. But the question is, nowadays, do people eat one slice as a snack? In other words, when you're eating a snack, would it be, I'll have some potato chips, I'll have a slice of pizza, I guess. Would it be like the same, or are you eating the pizza as a meal? You know what I mean? Nowadays, it would seem that leniency that you're mentioning, you're quoting, what they used to say from Ramesha Feinstein, many rabbis argue with it nowadays. They say that it's no longer a snack. One slice of pizza is not like eating a bag of potato chips. You're eating it as a meal. Because of that, they don't want to be lenient anymore, as even though Ramesha 50 years ago was lenient, that nowadays it seems that it's a meal. Yes, David.
I see.
Yeah, I was trying to figure out this particular granola bar. So I'm looking in the Kezias book. I have it also. So they have a certain type, but they have, I noticed that some of the things, usually Kezias we're thinking is about an ounce, which is like 28 grams. Some of the stuff he has in there are 14 grams as a Kezias, and some of them are 44 grams as a Kezias. So there's a huge range. So so these bars that I'm looking at, they're very granola-y, and I called up OU and I explained the situation, and I said, this is a 24 grams bar. Is this a Kezias or not? They said no. Kezias is 28 grams. Period. I said, well, what about different range? And they said it's 28 grams. That's what we go by. So they don't take into account all these different volumes.
Yeah, that's interesting that you mentioned, because grams is a weight, and there is a discussion. There is such an opinion that we go by weight, but that's not the commonly accepted view. Commonly accepted view goes by volume. Therefore, there's no set weight. It's easier to use weight. That would be the easiest way to do things, because you could just weigh everything and just go by that. But I'm surprised they told you that, because I didn't think that they follow that based on some of the things I read on their website. So I don't know, maybe you just got a certain rabbi that answering their questions not familiar with with their general protocol. But
Yeah, you didn't seem familiar with this older idea
right.
that the kazayas could be more or less.
Right. So it's based on that question. Is it a weight, the weight of an olive, or is it the volume of an olive? And that's really why in this book, the Kazayas book, it varies because it should vary. It's based on volume. But